Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode in our Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts series. In this episode, we're taking a look at part 3 of our Mafia Stories of Australia. For part 3, our focus is on the New South Wales arm of the Ndrangheta. Most Italians who migrated from Italy and settled in Australia just wanted to make a better life for themselves. Many leaving due to poverty, extortion and violence brought about through pretty much the mafia, especially in the southern areas of Italy. Some, however, wanted much more, to extort those from their own homeland and create a network of like-minded criminals here in Australia, along with back in their homeland, Calabria, which on the map is the toe of the boot, which is Italy. We know a few families, Calabrian in heritage, migrated to Australia with the purpose of setting up businesses that were not altogether legal. These families were part of the Calabrian crime family, Ndrangheta, or honoured society, who would, much like the Sicilian Mafia, make their wealth through illegal avenues. As far back as 1930, Italians were in trouble in the Griffith area with the law, even for distilling a little bit of grappa. In 1930, an Italian woman and others in her family were convicted for producing illegal substances. It was grappa, or as they called back then the Australians, brandy, a type of spirit. No one would deny an Italian a little bit of grappa. But in Australia, it was considered highly illegal to have your own still set up because they were pretty volatile. The members of their families settled in a couple of areas across Australia, one of them being the Riverina area of New South Wales, an agricultural region of southwestern New South Wales, an area of 80,000 square kilometres approximately, comprising of regional Wagga and Griffith communities. For the majority of the late 30s, 40s, as they were coming in, these families were setting themselves up, putting down roots among the communities. At first, to outsiders of the Italian community, they would have seemed much like any regular Italian immigrants, but to the Italian immigrants themselves, who honestly migrated, it would have been awful. They must have known the Ndrangheta was among them, pretending to be hard-working battlers like the rest of them. But soon those families sunk their teeth into other crop-growing businesses, trying to make a living, extorting them, especially at the Melbourne markets. As Frank Costa stated, it was a deadly business if you didn't pay them for prime vending places. Your crops could be left out in the sun to spoil.
Fruit and vegetable wholesale king Frank Costa saw the cartel in action.
What was happening was that they had the buyers of certain products, major lines, big volume, in their pocket. And those buyers would give them the order regardless, and it would get through quality control regardless, and they would receive weekly, I think it was mostly weekly, might have been monthly in some cases, but mostly weekly, a brown paper bag.
This group was the so-called Honoured Society.
Well, that's what they might have called them. I never used that expression, and our company never used that expression. We just used the expression, they're a bunch of ruthless merchants.
How corrupt was the system?
It was rotten to the core.
The families had a monopoly on the produce industry. Why the Melbourne markets? The Melbourne markets were a large produce market favoured by the Calabrian Mafia. Even those growing in the Riverina area took their produce to the Melbourne markets. They were established in Melbourne markets quite early, and it was about the same distance between Melbourne and Sydney to Griffith. That's where a lot of their produce would have gone. While most of the battlers were doing it tough through drought, the Calabrian and Ndrangheta families always did well. They had regular money coming in that could see them through the hard times, and the families grew in wealth. and size. In settling in the Riverina, it so happened that the whole district had the perfect climate and fertile ground for growing all manner of produce, citrus being one of the most successful. So these families were able to infiltrate the Melbourne markets, organising others to adhere to their terms and practices, to best suit the organisation and build the foundation to what was to become an extremely lucrative criminal empire of organised crime in Australia. Who were these families? Where did they come from? And why did they choose Australia? Dr. Anna Sergi says she had an interest in the Italian migration and discovered that some families with surnames associated with mafia operations back in Italy stood out to her. In the 1930s and 40s, such family members began migrating to Australia from very specific villages in the Aspromonte region, heavily associated with mafia activities. One of these villages was a town called Platti. While many Italians migrated to anywhere in Australia, the people from Platti, in sort of a chain migration, went to Griffith, the Riverina Valley, or Fairfield in Sydney. Roughly 5,000 of an approximate 9,000 from Platti migrated here between 1950 and 1970 into those particular areas. Now, Dr. Sergi was quite impressed with this figure, and that really stood out, as it would. 5,000 in a 20-year period. That's pretty crazy. It was these families, amongst others from Victoria, that were to create Australia's first, and still to this day, most profitable criminal organisation ever known. As they were already involved in and with crime networks, albeit very loosely organised at best, elsewhere in Australia, the Ndrangheta here had the foresight to begin cultivating marijuana and lots of it to supply the entire East Coast, who at this time couldn't get enough of the stuff. With a fresh supply straight from here in Australia, by the 1960s, it was their real money-making crop. For the Calabrian Mafia members of the Riverina district, Greater Murrumbidgee and beyond, their operations that centred on the cultivation and sale of vast amounts of quality marijuana thrived with basically no interference by law enforcement or anyone else for that matter for a good decade, approximately the years 1965 through to 1975. This was due for the most part because of the organisation's members having the tenacity and good fortune of having key New South Wales police and the odd politician on the payroll. To what level of assistance the police or a specific member of local, state, federal government depended on the nature of the hurdle, or so-called spanner in the works, of the family's multi-million-dollar drug cultivation, harvest and distribution process, and of course how much it was to cost to make any problems go away if one came up and had the capacity to interfere with operations. The meteoric rise that made the Griffith Mafia the key players very wealthy men that they had enjoyed for the best part of a decade was about to become harder than it had ever been before. The lucrative cash crops, major investments that were to make millions for the principals were in serious jeopardy. And in turn, the full extent of what it was these particular Italians in the area were really up to was set to become as public as it had ever been before, due for the most part to the efforts of Liberal Party member and the district's self-styled anti-drug campaigner, Mr. Donald Bruce Mackay. In 1975, Don Mackay got a letter detailing how to find a large crop of marijuana in the Collyambally irrigation area south of Griffith. He made contact with the Sydney Drug Squad and met some of the members secretly out of Griffith on the 10th of November. 2 Sydney Drug Squad officers and an officer from a country station came to Griffith. This fateful association between Don Mackay and the drug squad detectives from Sydney culminated in the November 11th, 1975 police raid on a property in Collyambally known as Stevenson's. Arrested on the site that day was a Giuseppe Agresta, Pasquale Agresta and Luigi Pocci, with some 6 to 7 others, able to escape apprehension by running from the crop area when it was apparent that police had arrived. All up, those arrested for their involvement in this major marijuana crop were Giuseppe Agresta, Pasquale Agresta, and Il Gambacorta, Luigi Pocci, and Francesco Sergi. The immature crop was 12.76 hectares and worth up to $80 million. The crop was destroyed and the site sprayed to prevent regrowth. There was evidence of a previous crop or crops already harvested. It was the raid that spelt the beginnings of the very public feud between Donald Mackay and the Riverina, particularly Ndrangheta. It was this Collyambally crop, its subsequent loss, and the loss of millions in income it was set to make the families. And it was also the start of a timeline that would end in less than 2 years' time with the disappearance and now confirmed murder of Don as a direct result of his anti-drugs campaign in the winter of 1977. After the bust at Collyambally, to the Calabrian organised crime families, it was still business as usual. There was far too much money at stake to let the 1975 crop loss, and to them a local furniture store owner pest, get in the way of the organisation's bread and butter at the time. And so large-scale crops continued to be grown in and around the district, which only made Mackay more willing to stick his neck out and amass intelligence of the next crop and the information of it to police once again. In July 1976, Vincenzo Ciccarello acquired and took possession of a property near Euston for $92,000 on behalf of, according to Justin Woodward's later findings, Robert Ozzy Bob Trimboli. On the 1st of March 1977, a harvest comprising of almost 2 tons of marijuana was located at Domenico Velarde's home at Fairfield in Sydney. This marijuana was later proved to have been part of the Euston crop. Woodward described it as the largest single seizure of prepared leaf in the state at that time. Judge John Murray Ford fined Domenico Velarde $5,000 and put him on a 3-year good behaviour bond on the 13th of December 1978. The Euston plantation was raided 4 days after the Velarde raid, on the 5th of March 1977. 4 were eventually arrested: V. Ciccarello, V. Piccineri, V&S Barbaro, one being a cousin of a previously convicted Griffith grower. The plantation was 5.86 hectares or 14.5 acres, much of it already harvested. Once the court case for the Collyambally marijuana bust and seizure by police was underway, all the evidence the local mafia families needed regarding exactly who it was behind the intelligence that culminated in the very successful drug squad, which in turn cost the crime families millions in lost revenue, and with the publicity stemming from the whole situation, meant that the locals especially had for the first time proof that the profile Italians, suspected members of a secret criminal organisation, secret society based out of Griffith, were involved in some way in the production and distribution of illegal drugs. These revelations and or assumptions proved to be a major thorn in the side for decades to come. Justifiably so. For example, Mr. Antonio Sergi, whose winery he created in Griffith and today known as Warburn Estate, was linked to this industrial-scale marijuana crop bust due to a relative who was directly involved and his namesake. Today, Warburton Estates is in the top 10 largest wine producers in Australia. The evidence was clear as to who it was that was the local Ndrangheta's enemy, numero uno, that of course being Don McKay. Over the next almost 2 years, between Collyamberley crop bust in late 1975 and the disappearance and assumed murder of Donald Bruce McKay, both sides were going at each other. Don McKay, who, for better or worse, never faltered from his position to keep up the campaign against and hopefully see through to prosecution all those individuals who would turn their town into what was described at the time in the newspapers across the country and the national 6 o'clock news as the drug capital of Australia. The so-called Ndrangheta or honoured society mafia members of the district at first knew McKay was almost too high profile a member of the community to warrant immediate assassination of him for the trouble he'd already caused them, the crime families and their bottom line. Almost. It was decided by the heads of the local clans that something needed to be done about McKay, and one of the first things they organised was to attempt to scare Don, make him think about what he was doing, try and get him to drop off the Calabrese criminals and their businesses. When that didn't work, attempts were made to lure Don into incriminating himself. One example being when a prostitute summoned to Griffith from Sydney to pose as a customer in Don's furniture store. This attractive and practised in the art of false seduction woman came in dressed in revealing clothing, asking Don to show her a queen-size bed that she wanted to buy, only to then lay on the bed and, with her best come-hither look, make an obvious pass at Don, hoping he'd disregard his marriage and want to meet her in private to discuss things further. Because of Don's constitution and his unwavering love to Barbara, his wife, he told this woman to leave his store at once. When all else failed to make Don McKay drop off the pursuit of the local mafia members, things such as anonymous phone calls all hours of the day and night that always hung up when answered, to the time Don made an over-the-phone sale that the caller promptly paid for in advance with a falsified bank card, with delivery of this piece of furniture to an address within the district only to arrive at a vacant lot, and also money bribes sent to him to keep quiet were also then donated to charity, and he kept strong in his resolve. After they'd researched as much as possible what it was that drove McKay, there are a couple of reasons that become obvious. Because Don was governed by his Christian values, the man was uncorruptible, which is a part of Donald Bruce McKay's personality that the local crime families were soon to find out. Don was well known to be an active campaigner for the Liberal government in his local area. He was, to the rest of the population of Griffith, someone who was accessible to the public. He was the type of man who'd listen to the townspeople should they have an issue that the local or state government should be able to rectify, including what to do about the criminal organisation that lived amongst them, who had turned the area into a highly efficient, highly profitable drug cultivation and distribution network. It wasn't just Don, who was fed up with the cashed-up criminal element of the Calabrian Mafia members and their associates. It seemed that many other farmers in the district felt the same way too, and it was the information regarding the crop growers that they brought to Don, which in turn promoted him to take action to try and stop them, assuming the role of the anti-drugs campaigner as a consequence. Apart from that, Don and those anonymous townspeople who wanted these criminals stopped as well, because the town of Griffith was now being coined by the media nationwide as a new drug capital of Australia, which was a real gripe to the legitimate people whose association with the Riverina town spanned generations, which meant they were proud of their home. And for it to become known for the illegal cultivation and distribution of tons of marijuana, to them it was something that brought on feelings of not only embarrassment, but shame too. It was for these reasons Donald Mackay had to act as a proud Griffith local, but also because of a feeling of a duty to the place and the other people in the town who didn't have a platform to voice their disdain for the current situation in the way Don Mackay had. It was at this point that the crime families of the Griffith area, the boss of each family, agreed that there was only one more way they could stop Don Mackay from interfering with their business interests, and that was to hire a professional killer from Melbourne who would come into town and at the right time take Don out and make sure not a trace of him was ever found. And that is precisely what they made happen. It was the afternoon of July 15th in 1977. Mackay left his furniture store at around 5:30 to 5:40 and drove into the parking lot of the Griffith Hotel. Inside, it is believed that he drank with friends for approximately an hour. About the same time, Roy Lawrence Binks, an accountant in his premises, which had a common wall with the Griffith Hotel car park, heard the sound of a whip cracking 2 or 3 times a few seconds apart, and the sound or noise like someone being sick or vomiting, and likened to groaning. He didn't jump up and call the police at this time. I mean, it was a hotel, and it's possible that many drunks often come out and stagger about and vomit in the car park on occasions. So he went about his business. Mrs. Edna Gladys Harrigan, a former waitress at the hotel, said there had been no lights on in the hotel car park when she arrived at work about 6:15 on July 15th. The lights had been working the night before. On the morning of July 16th, Edna had found the 2 globes of the car park lights were broken. Mrs. Patricia Betts stated she had known Don Mackay for 18 years, and often she'd see him in the hotel and he'd wave or smile at her. But on this particular night, he didn't do so. He left the hotel looking very concerned, followed by a man she believed was in his 30s, of Italian descent, shoulder length, brown hair, and heavily built. She thought she had seen the man again later on in November of 1977 in a television program about a mafia gang war in Chicago. The police showed her a similar film, but she was unable to identify the man. When Don hadn't arrived home at 7 o'clock as he was meant to that evening, Barbara became concerned. She rang the family solicitor, Ian Salmon, who was working around the area, and she told Ian of her concerns for Don. Ian promised her that he would go and drive around and try and locate Don for her. After seeing the van parked in the hotel, pulling up to the minivan, he shone his lights from his car on the minivan and he could see blood, he could see keys, and he could see a handprint on the window. He knew something had gone wrong and called the police right away. Police investigations and later ballistic and scientific tests indicated that Mackay was about to unlock his van when he was struck. He'd been shot 3 times in the head with a .22 caliber weapon and dragged to another vehicle. His keys were under the lock. They'd worked this out, being that his keys were dropped directly at the lock of the car. There was blood on the door, on the hubcap, the ground, and a nearby fence. 3 spent .22 cartridge cases were found near the bloodstains on the ground, and there were scuff marks on the ground near the driver's door, extending from the position of the keys and joining together near the bloodstains. There was no doubt that Don had been murdered. We've ended the story with the sad end of Don Mackay's life. Agree or disagree with his motives, by all accounts, Donald Bruce Mackay was the epitome of a decent, hard-working family man, a man who always had time for his wife and kids. Don was also a man who, if not for his involvement in the pursuit of the Calabrian Mafia members, who he lived amongst, the largest ever before in scale in this country, marijuana growers, who used the town of Greater Griffith as her own personal drug production and always ready to buy distribution network operation, Donald Bruce Mackay would have grown old in Griffith, still married to and in love with Barbara, and looking forward to their regular visits by their children and many grandchildren. Don Mackay was a brave man. He would not back down for what he believed to be right. Not for a very large, very dangerous and cunning lot of criminals, especially if it was going to ensure the safety of his family and the greater community. There's a lot more to this entire story, and in the new episodes we will take a closer look into the details of a number of incidents in the episode you've just seen. The coming episodes will not only be about key members of the Griffith Honoured Society, but will also be dedicated to specific crime family clans, of which there are many stories. So keep that notification bell on the all setting, and anyone who hasn't done so yet, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. Till next time.
There are some here who have brought shame to the town. Let me state categorically that most of the Italian population are as adamant as we are that this has existed. They came from Italy to get away from this sort of thing, and they're not at all happy about the developments here.
Oh, well, I think it's very serious. It should be looked into more than what it has been.
Do you believe all the stories about Griffith being the drug capital?
My word.
What makes you believe it?
Well, there's so much been going on for so many years. You just got to.
Do you believe that a mafia-type organisation exists in this town?
Yes, I do.
You're that certain?
I am that certain.
Do most of the people in Griffith believe that a mafia-type organisation has existed here?
Of course they do.
Why hasn't anything ever been done about this before?
I don't know. Actually, one of the Royal Commission investigators said to me when it first started, this should have been done years ago, and I couldn't have agreed more.
Well, everyone here has known exactly what the report said for 2 years. It's no news to anyone in Griffith whatsoever, I'm sure. I'm still very, very angry, and I'm waiting to make sure that something's done. I'd like to see the investigation still continue into what happened to my father and the activities of the people named in the report from now on.
Is it surprising that the town hasn't taken its own action before this?
No, not really, although sometimes I wish it had. It has been difficult to, drive down the main street and see people are involved, having a good time and spending more money than they ever have, which they are doing now.